Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Safer Streets lecture. Thank you all so much for attending. My name is Steve Starcevich. I'm a volunteer with the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition and the facilitator of its Transportation Action Team. This lecture was funded by a community empowerment grant from the City of Corvallis and sponsored by the Sustainability Coalition's Transportation Action Team, Corvallis Right of Way, and the Dixon Creek Neighborhood Association. We are very excited to introduce our speaker, but first I'd like to direct your attention to a couple of Zoom technicalities. First, please locate and click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. We are hoping for a lively question and answer session immediately following the presentation. As a question occurs to you, please enter it in the Q&A window and press enter. Local transportation expert Sarah Bronstein has kindly agreed to moderate the Q&A. I will introduce Sarah after the presentation. The second tip is that we suggest you watch the presentation in side-by-side mode so you can see the speaker and the presentation at the same time. To change the view mode, locate the view icon in the upper right-hand corner of the Zoom window. The Safer Streets lecture is entitled Rethinking Streets for Safety, Health, Climate, Affordability, Equity, Happiness, Apple Pie, and more. I don't think the timing of this talk could be any better. Many towns and cities around the world are going through a rethinking of their streets. The rethinking is driven by the urgent need to make our streets safe for all road users and reduce carbon pollution. As you can tell from the presentation title, making streets safe and our transportation system non-polluting can also bring many other community benefits. Some countries like Denmark and the Netherlands have been rethinking and redesigning their streets for decades. Their streets are much safer and they are experiencing these other community benefits to an astonishing degree. Out of envy and admiration, we have to ask, how did they get there? What street designs and design principles can we learn from more advanced communities? How can we apply these principles and designs in Corvallis or the community you live in? Let's see here. We are in luck because it's our speaker's job to ask these questions and then try to answer them through his research and publications. Our speaker is Professor of City Planning at the University of Oregon and lead author of 3 books on street redesign. He is also the leader of a bicycle transport study abroad course to Denmark and the Netherlands. I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Marc Schlossberg.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Let me share my screen here. If we hear any barking or licking, water licking in the background, I have a pandemic puppy that will be joining us and hopefully not too vocally. So thanks a lot for having me tonight. I'm going to be going through like 80 slides or something in 40 minutes and then look forward to the conversation and the Q&A and we'll see where that goes. So I want to start though with a few caveats just to get us going. So first, I want you to know that I don't know Corvallis very well. I'm in Eugene, so I've obviously been to Corvallis many times. I've been in Eugene for about 20 years now, but I don't know the ins and outs of Corvallis. So if I say anything that is not quite applicable to Corvallis, then we can talk about that later on. So I don't know Corvallis very well, other than it's lovely, and it's special, and it's unique, just like many other places, which comes into play a lot when we talk about redesigning our cities for people on bike or walking or scootering or for transit. So a couple other caveats, just so you know where I'm coming from. I don't know the names of my bike parts. There's wheels and there's a frame and there's handlebars and there's a seat that I sit on, but that's about it for me. I've never owned Lycra as far as I know. Not that there's anything wrong with it. Just haven't ever had it. Last summer, surprisingly, for someone who teaches this stuff, I bought my first ever non-hand-me-down bike, which you can see in the upper right, which I love because it has built-in lights, which is like every bike should have that, just the way every car that we buy has built-in lights. And this happened at the age of 51. I don't mind driving at all, actually, even if it's a left-handed stick shift. For the year I lived in England, driving on the left-hand side of the road, that was quite a fun challenge every time trying to do it. Yet I don't really like being socially engineered into car dependency, which is what most of us in the United States actually are through 70 years of land use and transportation policy that has basically stolen any reasonable choice, modal choice, transportation modal choice from most of us. So the goal then, when I think about bicycle transportation and redesigning cities for people on bike, isn't to make everyone on a bike all the time, but it's to borrow from organization that used to be called Bikes Belong, now they're called People for Bikes, that their mantra was, for a while, was that the goal is to have more people traveling by bike more of the time. And I really subscribe to that idea. So those are my caveats. So how I became interested in this topic is a little bit random and very practical. And I think that serves us well for our conversation tonight. So I became interested in redesigning cities for people on bike one day when I was biking two of my little children, or my children when they were little, to preschool. And I was hit by a car on the way of just doing this very normal deed of bringing them to preschool before I went on to work. And they were okay, and I was okay. But in my twisted academic brain, as I was laying on the ground, upset that I was just hit by a driver in a car, I thought the way I'm going to get back at that driver is I'm going to start teaching a class on bicycle transportation. And so I did. So the beauty of having a little bit of freedom within academia is I started teaching a whole mixed class of undergraduate and graduate students, 100% focused on redesigning cities for bicycle transportation. And I think that this became one of the first exclusively focused classes of its kind in the country. This was around 2005, and it's been going every year since. It's usually around 50 students, and it's always fully subscribed. So that was my start. It wasn't anything more than that. I didn't really know anything about the topic, but over time, I came to learn a little bit. And those poor students, that first year I taught the class, I was just winging it with a little bit more knowledge than everyone else had. So my little children are now big kids, and this is just a way to show off that I have really wonderful children. Okay, so why do we care so much about bikes or bicycle transportation in the year 2021? And there's a lot of compelling reasons why we should care, sort of in the big picture, right? We care about climate change. Corvallis, Eugene, and many other cities are really serious, or at least they say that they're serious in trying to do their part for meeting our obligations to meet the urgent and existential threat of climate change. And bicycle transportation, as humanity's most efficient invention, zero carbon, non-polluting way of getting around, is certainly a key piece of the puzzle to reducing our emissions from the transportation sector. Bicycle transportation also has a simultaneous opportunity to address massive issues around equity or inequity, particularly when we imagine that for the dominant transportation system that we have, getting around by car is exclusively discriminatory against anyone that's under the age of 16, anyone who cannot afford to own and operate a car, anyone who has any physical limitation that prevents them from owning and operating a car, plus those who choose not to. So there's a huge opportunity here to address the transportation across the spectrum. We care also about affordability. And here I talk about household affordability rather than affordable housing, because really our household costs and expenditures is a function of the combination of what we pay for rent or a mortgage plus our transportation costs. And together those are our household affordability costs. So if we can reduce our transportation costs a little bit, we may be able to afford more housing. So one of our strategies for addressing our critical problems of affordable housing actually is to reduce our transportation cost, in addition to building more and better and more affordable housing itself. Of course, we are also cognizant of this last 15 months around the need for spatial distancing, and bicycle transportation, along with walking, of course, provides us an opportunity to do that if we have the space to do so, especially at a time when there's some reluctance to be on transit, or maybe to use Uber and Lyft or carpool or other modes where we're in close proximity to others, which hopefully we are sort of coming out of this. And then there's other public health reasons as well, just that we don't build our cities so that we have any physical activity just built into our daily routines, among other things around air pollution and water pollution, et cetera. And there's more things like around independence and freedom and social trust and social cohesion. So lots of overlapping, integrated aspects of how we likely want our society to function can be tied to making our cities better for more people to use a bike more of the time. We also care about bikes in this year because in the US, and still even in Oregon with our urban growth boundaries, we have a land use system that is actually not that efficient. It's actually quite sprawling, and relative to the rest of the country, Oregon cities are not super sprawling, but still, I don't think that any of us would look at our communities, whether it's Corvallis or Eugene, and call them models of dense mixed use development, walkable ways to getting around. Right? So the places that we go are pretty far distance from one another. And the bicycle is actually a really good distance spanner in a way that walking is not because of distance, and in a way that transit doesn't function in a lower density environment. And so a bicycle is actually a nice different mode that spans distance. And so just as an example, for work trips in a city like Copenhagen, the kind of acceptable, typical sort of distance for a bike commute to work is about 7 miles. And to put that in context, if we were to randomly pick a center point of Corvallis, again, I don't know Corvallis very well, so I just went for the street grid to identify downtownish. So hopefully I got close, right? To go north, well, that's only 3 miles. To go south, that's a little over 3 miles. 7 miles gets you way out of town, right? So the actual city boundaries of Corvallis is well within what's a very acceptable commute range in a place like Copenhagen. And just to be fair for Eugene Springfield, or if we put ourselves at in the middle of the universe, the University of Oregon, of course, and then went west to the edge of Eugene, that's still within 7 miles. If we went east, we can get through most of Springfield. We can get to the northern edge as well, out of the city limits and into the city of Coburg. So there's a lot of opportunity here. And so in a place like Copenhagen, this is a map of Copenhagen, and in the green thick lines here, these are not lines of their bicycle lanes. This is the network of what they call their bicycle superhighways. So these are like not just really high quality, amazing bicycle infrastructure for normal people to get around, but these are even beyond that. So you can pretty much ride on any of these routes, any of these corridors during peak journey to work times and never hit a red light in any of the way that you're going. So this is how distance is accommodated because the speed of travel, not this pedaling speed, but the time of your trip can be optimized by reducing your friction of traffic lights and so forth. So we'll get into some of the details. Okay, I also want to I want all of us to keep in mind that even though I just talked about the work trip in Copenhagen and the land use of Corvallis and Eugene, that it's really important not to focus actually on the work trip. The work trips are actually really hard trips in general to plan our transportation around comprehensively as a society, because the households that we live in tend to have really complex work-home relationships, and the decisions that we make on where we live are not always optimized based on where we work, or if we have 2 working or more than 2 people working in our household, it might just not be possible. So for those of you who live in Corvallis and work in another city, don't tell me that biking isn't for you because you can't bike to work. Great, don't bike to work. But most trips that we take are actually non-work trips. And this is a dirty little secret of transportation planning, transportation policy, and transportation engineering, is that our transportation infrastructure, the street, is pretty much exclusively optimized to address the peak trip to work, right? The rush hour time. Even though in a place like Corvallis, I'm guessing, is like Eugene, that rush hour, if it exists, is maybe 5 hours a week, maybe 10 hours a week at most. And so there's 168 other hours, 168 other hours in the week that is not that rush hour trip. And so by thinking about those other trips that we take to the coffee shop, to the park, to the grocery, to see a friend, to play ultimate frisbee, whatever it might be, those are non-work trips. And those are certainly the trips that we can be focusing on for bicycle transportation, because they tend to be shorter, more local, and more frequent. Okay, so I've been asked to give you a bicycle transportation primer 101. So I apologize if this is too simple, but I want to have everyone on the same page here. And so hopefully it's not. Hopefully it's not. So there are some interesting categorizations of all of us into one of 4 types of cyclists. And this was courtesy of Roger Geller, who I misspelled his name, who was working in the city of Portland as bicycle transportation coordinator. And so he sort of on the back of an envelope made this observation that's since been confirmed through different research studies. But he said there's 4 types of, all of us can be categorized in one of 4 types of cyclists. About 1% of us are strong and fearless, and we will ride our bike on a street like this, mixed with cars because we're legally allowed to do so. And we have a moral bubble that protects us, and that's 1% of us. Then there's like 30, 35% of us that we are a no way, no how cyclists. So like my uncle, or you name a member of your family, or maybe it's you yourself, that it doesn't matter like how nice of a path or how nice of a bike or how beautiful of a day, like you're not getting on a bike or they're not getting on a bike. Great, we don't have to do anything for them. For that 1%, we don't need to do anything for them either. All the streets already exist for them. Then there's about 7% of the population that are characterized as enthused and confident. So this is where I am. And so for enthused and confident people, a bike lane works. And that's for about 7% of us. I feel okay riding in a bike lane. I'm never happy. I have a really negative narrative in my head the entirety of the time that I might bike in something like this, about who's going to open their door in front of me, which car is going to cut me off, who's going to yell at me going by. It's a very negative narrative in my head, but it's a space for me on a bike. And so I will do it if this is what I need to do to get from here to there. So that leaves the rest of society, or the rest of us, and I'll put myself in that enthused and confident, but this group, the interested but concerned. And this is like whatever's left, 50 to 60% of the population. I'm a city planner, so close enough is good enough. And so this is the area that bicycle transportation planners, or those of us who are thinking about how to redesign cities so that more people can use a bike more of the time, are really focused on. And this is a group of people who think, yeah, I'll get on a bike. I'm not opposed to bike. I don't hate cyclists. I would love to be able to do it. I would love to have my 10-year-old kid be able to bike to school or bike to a friend's house. It's just that I'm not putting them or me on a street, because I think that the environment feels unsafe, right? So it's a difference between going out on a street like we have on the left with just a regular bike lane, right? It could be you, or think about your 10-year-old if you have one, or your future 10-year-old if you'll have one, or a 10-year-old niece or nephew. Will you put them on that street on the left, or how would you feel being on the infrastructure on the right? And so there's a term for this. It's called the level of traffic stress. And this was some really interesting research that a professor from Northeastern University in Boston, Peter Firth, came up with, which was basically a way to rate a given road segment or a crossing that indicates the traffic stress it imposes on people on bike. And the basic idea is that if a part of your journey on bike exceeds your stress level, then there's no journey on bike that's going to happen. Like, it doesn't matter if 90% of your trip is like the environment on the right-hand picture. If the environment on the left-hand picture is just too stressful for you or too stressful for the child that you're wanting to go to the downtown library, then it's not going to be a bike trip. So it's important to remember that. And another way to do it is to use this caption picture from someone I like on Twitter. His name's Tom Flood, and he does all kinds of really insightful caption and images like this. So here's a child biking on a very typical looking bike lane. He says, if children walk to school in our bike lanes, would cities still consider paint a good enough barrier? Right, so what he's trying to say here is, look, this is what most cities do for our bike infrastructure. Would we send our kids down that to school on foot if this is what our sidewalks as well? Of course, the answer is no. So why is this an acceptable way to build our bikes? And it's no wonder we don't have more people getting around town, including our children, getting to school or getting to friends or going to ice cream or going to soccer practice or music lessons or whatever it might be by bike, because this is the reality of the environment for most of our communities. Certainly for most of them here in Oregon, and Oregon is better than most in the country. So we have a long way to go. So then there's some bicycle facility types. So we just covered the different types of cyclists, and then there's different type of infrastructure. And the interesting thing, or the non-interesting thing with bicycle infrastructure, is that it varies from block to block and street to street and city to city in a way that is not the same for our car infrastructure, which is very regular, very standardized, very predictable, no matter what community you're in or what block you turn from one street to the next. So there are things called bicycle boulevards or neighborhood greenways. And in these situations, the goal is to create connected networks on quieter residential streets where there's some small tweaks to the neighborhood streets that limit the connectivity for cars, but optimize the connectivity for people on bike. So the image here is a good example where cars cannot enter the neighborhood this way, but people on bike can, but there's still car access to the houses that live there. So there's a variety of techniques to make these small changes that just prioritize the connectivity for people on bike and restrict those same roads as throughways for people on car. Those create really comfortable places, family-friendly places to be on a bike. And they're relatively low cost, and they take advantage of what are otherwise low volume, quieter residential streets. And so this is what should be done for the residential network. Then there's these things called sharrows, and it's just putting that little decal on the road. And those are mostly meaningless and extremely lazy. And they're put down by people who ought to know better. And if they're put down by people who don't know better, then they also have no business of putting them down. So to put down a sharrow like this symbol on a street without doing anything to the design of the street to slow cars down actually makes the environment less safe for people on bikes. So this should never, ever, ever, ever be done if there is not also complementary work to slow the vehicular speed down. It is an absolutely lazy intervention for people to do. Then there's the bike lane, sort of the standard stuff for the old days. We have this all over Oregon, thanks to a bicycle bill that was passed by the Oregon legislature in 1971 that mandated that every of our busy street had a bike lane on it. So we see them all over the place in Oregon for sure. But it's kind of a funny thing. Some of you may have heard talks by others that describe this type of environment where there's parking on the curb and traffic lanes for cars and a bike lane as kind of a big question mark. Like, why would we have people on bike acting as a buffer between the moving cars and the parked cars? It's like cyclists are like protecting the parked cars, with our bodies. So that's a kind of a silly design, and really that's an old-fashioned design and not a good one for the modern era. There's a new type of infrastructure, relatively new. It's called the buffered bike lane. So it's like a bike lane, but there's a few extra feet of paint. And this actually works pretty well. It adds a little bit more separation, a physical separation, and also a visual cue to everyone on the street of who belongs where. And that little bit of extra space, even though it's very permeable, actually does quite a good job of communicating the space and creating a little extra space for people on bike. And so this has an advantage because it's really cheap. I mean, you have to sort of go through the political cost of reallocating space on the right of way on the street for bikes, but in terms of actual infrastructure costs, it's paint. And in the scheme of things, that's pretty cheap. And then there's the gold standard of what we want to do on every major street in our communities. And yes, every major street is called a cycle track or a protected bikeway. And on a cycle track or a protected bikeway, the cyclists are protected by some sort of physical barrier from the moving vehicles. So in this case, the protection is actually a row of parked cars. So it's just flipping the space where the bike lane is and where the parked cars are, with a little bit of a buffer area. In this case, that's a door zone. So if a door opens from the passenger side, it sort of opens without going into the bikeway. And so this is the strategy that a city that is serious about meeting all of those social, environmental, and economic goals and really wanting to be a world-class bicycling city needs to do on all of the busy streets. And it's not a matter of doing it on this street or that street. It's all of the busy streets. And in fact, the busier the street, the better the bike infrastructure ought to be, which is the complete opposite of our tendency in this country, which is to look at really busy streets and think that they're too complicated and too difficult and therefore shouldn't be a candidate for good bike infrastructure. So the punchline here to create a great biking city, which why invest any time and effort to just have a mediocre, not very well used bicycle infrastructure? That seems like a waste of time. So if we really want to go for it and want to create great biking city, which we have great bones, and Corvallis has great bones, Eugene has great bones, thanks to the bike law from 1971. So the punchline is pretty simple for an academic to say, at least, that we need protected bike lanes on all major streets. We need a connected network, of neighborhood greenways that are designed to limit vehicular speeds, right? So there's a design element there and a connectivity network. And actually, the intersections have to have some protected treatments as well, especially at the junction of two busy streets. And we're not going to talk about protected intersections now. That's like that's bicycle transportation planning 201 or 301. And then I have two add-ons to that. So that's the punchline, like clear as day. If we're really serious about making it possible for anyone aged 8 to 80 to feel safe, comfortable, and convenient getting around our communities on a bike as a normal activity for normal people doing normal daily things without having an agenda of being a cyclist or an environmentalist or anything, just living our lives, this is what needs to happen. And then there's two add-ons. As I said before, the bigger the street or the bigger the intersection, the better the bike infrastructure needs to be. And I can't emphasize this enough. It's really important because it's those really complicated, big, busy places that create the most stress for someone on bike. And so that's where the best infrastructure needs to happen for people on bike. And if we're serious about creating a great place to be on a bike to meet those big challenges, driving must be harder and more expensive in both cost and time and convenience. And this is not something typically that elected leaders or formal city staff will say out loud because it just leads to a public yelling at you. So I'm here to tell you that if we're really serious to meet our climate change goals, driving has to be more expensive and harder to do. And making it more expensive and harder to do also increases the attractiveness, assuming there's good facilities, of getting around by bike. And when you do those things, these are all the good things that get to happen. You get to have real infrastructure that is designed and built for you on a bike. So this is in the city of Utrecht in the Netherlands, where there's real bike infrastructure and lighting that's geared for you on a bike. And normal people are just using it to get to their normal tasks and their normal jobs. And I think this is in Germany. I don't remember where I grabbed this picture, but normal people totally segregated from the movement of cars. It doesn't matter what the cars on the street are doing in a design like this. It's like riding a bike on a river path, an off-street river path in nature, but you're in an urban area getting to the places that we need to get to live our lives. This is in London, what it can look like, where you're separated from cars. This is in Copenhagen. It rains in Copenhagen, just like it used to rain in Oregon. Maybe it'll rain again here, right? Where here the separation is both a little bit more of the sort of extra sidewalk area to the left of the cyclist, plus on-street car parking. Your infrastructure can be big enough so that you can have actually dedicated signals and dedicated turn lanes just for people on bike off of these networks. A typical design in Copenhagen actually looks like this. Their cycle tracks are a little bit elevated from the roadway and a little bit lower than the sidewalk. So it's a couple inches higher from the road where the cars go and a couple inches lower from where pedestrians are, which makes this design extremely permeable for people on bike to get on and off wherever they want, but it's still visually and topographically separated from where the cars are going. This is another example in a more urban area. You can see the beginning of the cycle track here on the right-hand side, people using it in the rain. There's another good example of it. And you get this type of scene all the time, just like normal, regular people going about safely and comfortable doing their normal, regular things. And then when you're really getting to cool tipping points, you get to do really fun things. So this is in the city of Utrecht in the Netherlands, which is Europe's top cycling city. 50% of all trips in the city of Utrecht are done by bike. 50%, half. Just so you hear me properly, half of all trips that people age 8 to 80 are done by people on bike or by bike. And so if you look at the image on the left, in the very background, at the very top here, you can see that this is the top of a bridge. And so this path the cyclist on the left-hand side is on, and then in the picture in the upper right, it sort of skirts around, is a ramp that gets from kind of ground level where the buildings and housing are up to the level of the bridge. And so there's a very casual, really nice ramp. And then tucked underneath this ramp up to the bridge is an elementary school, which is super cool. And you can see all the bikes in the upper right-hand picture of the kids that rode their bike to school here. And that's what you get when you have 50% of all your trips by bike. And you get issues like this, which we can talk about bike parking another day. What do you do when you actually achieve lots of cycling? How do you accommodate bikes? How do you find your bike if you've forgotten where you parked it? And then back to the city of Utrecht that recently opened a dedicated bike parking structure that houses 12,000 bikes that's full every day. And that you can bike up to the multiple stories to find the place to park your bike. It's pretty incredible. But we'll talk about bike parking and that level another day, though, in communities like Corvallis and Eugene, where we have big universities and a relatively compact sort of urban core, the idea of having actual legitimate parking structures for people on bike is not as far-fetched as it might be in other parts of our other communities. And also for a conversation on another day is what to do with more rural roads like this one, where this actually allows two-way car traffic, even though there's only space for one direction of car movement down the middle. This is called an advisory bike lane. But again, that's like bicycle transportation 301. But then again, this is like a typical scene when you have an infrastructure that's really built for safety, for comfort. You get normal people doing normal things and doing it in ways that's perfectly safe. And you'll notice probably through most of these pictures that very few people are wearing helmets. And that's because the safety of the system doesn't come from individuals wearing a helmet. The safety actually comes from segregating people from moving cars. And that's where the problems are. Those of us who ride a bike fall over the same way as those of us who are walking. So it's not a very common thing. The problem is when there's the collisions with vehicles. People who do go for more weekend racing, sort of long distance country rides at higher speeds, tend to wear helmets because it's a different type of activity. You just get, normal people doing their normal things, and big clumps of people moving all the time, taking your dogs around or going out or going to work, not wearing specialized clothing just your regular clothes on a regular bike, doing your regular thing, and just using a bike to get there. Different types of bikes then become possible, different tools for people to use. There's different designs that can be made. So on the image on the left, when we have a dedicated cycle track, notice how the bus stop doesn't cross the bike lane to let people on or off. There's a special island for people to get on and off the bus. And when those people get on or off the bus and want to cross over to the sidewalk, pedestrians have the right of way and people on the bike path will yield as need be. And these are just like, there's nothing special about these images. These are just pictures I took of just normal everyday scenes of just what it's like when you're in cities that have spent the last 50 years going from a car-oriented urban form to one that prioritizes getting around by bike. It's not eliminating getting around by car, as clearly seen by these images. But your daily tasks of getting flowers or being able to ride socially with a partner, with a friend, is amazing, right? To be able to ride socially next to someone and still have space for other people to pass you and not feel like you're in the way of a car, in the way that you can just tune out the world and enjoy the person that you're with and do it on a bike is quite magical to experience. Yeah, just trying to communicate like a whole range of, I don't know any of these people, so I'm assuming they're normal enough, doing normal enough things, and doing it with a bike as their tool. And it's awesome when you see clumps and clumps and clumps of kids getting to school on their own without any problems. So those are all, overseas examples. And it's easy for people to say like, oh, well, those are overseas. Those don't apply. We can talk about that at the Q&A. But I do want to point out that changes to our streets have been happening in the US, especially over the last 10 or 15 years, and picking up a lot in the last 5, including some cities doing a lot during COVID to rethink their streets. So there has been changes that have been happening to our streets, whether they're protected bike lanes or painting the street to slow traffic down and bring art in, or dedicated bus lanes in certain cities, or parklets, repurposing parking spaces for sitting. And of course, now during COVID, a lot of cities, I'm not familiar, Corvallis has done this, but I'm sure they have in some places, opening up some of the spaces that were dedicated to car parking for dining now. So from the bike world, here's New York City, here's Manhattan, right? The crazy busy place. And then you can have this completely dedicated environment to tune out the crazy busyness of New York and get around by bike. Atlanta, Oakland, with the parking protected bikeway, Denver, Cambridge, Jackson, Wyoming, not the place that you normally think about, South Bend, Indiana, Lincoln, Nebraska, Modesto, California, Tampa, Florida. So these things are happening all over the place. And in Eugene, we have a couple that students actually in my program helped design, which is great, a parking protected 2-way bikeway, and a new one that just opened up that has a physical barrier that connects the university and downtown Eugene. So these types of things are actually happening all across the country. So building more of them are no longer a risky endeavor for cities like Corvallis to do. There's plenty of experiences from the US. Of course, it is helpful to look at cities that have made complete comprehensive systems of these bicycle networks to see how they've done them. But it's not like, oh, they've done it in Copenhagen, we can't do it in the US or a different context. We can look now to experiments and real projects in cities across the United States and use them as fuel to do things further. So we'll put up the link to these 3 books again at the end, but I've been part of creating 3 case study books of before and after finalized projects from across the US to help give you information, data, language to use to push and advocate for change locally if you find yourself wanting to do that. So these are all free to download online. they're courtesy of taxpayers. So thank you for helping fund the production of them. But what's typical in our communities is none of those things that I just showed you. What's typical in our communities are streets like this, where the cyclists, people, humans on bikes, act as the buffers between the moving cars and the parked cars. We have bike lanes that are right next to fast moving cars, which exceeds most of our stress levels. Very few of us will feel comfortable biking on a street like this because of the speed and the proximity to motorized cars. We also do this weird thing where we use the bike lane as a bus loading and unloading zone, right? And what could be more horrifying than biking next to fast moving cars, but then to have a large bus move over or across your bike lane as well. So this is also a very not modern design of our street. We typically have busy streets like this that actually have no spaces for bikes because we look at them and think, ooh, it's already so busy. We can't do something for bikes because what's going to happen to all the cars that are there? So let's go find a parallel route, even though the places we might want to go to are on this street. This is also very typical, is to have a bike lane that, well, to have a car lane that crosses a bike lane so that cars can turn right. Why would we do that? This is a terrible, terrible, terrible design that's done exclusively to make it easier and more convenient for people in cars to make a right-hand turn at the direct expense to the comfort and safety for people on bikes. I know you have a lot of these in Corvallis because we have a lot of these in every city because this is an outdated, though many local officials think it's quite modern, look at the green, way of designing an intersection. But don't be mistaken, this design is entirely to prioritize the movement of cars over the movement of people on foot or on bike. Some communities like Eugene, I don't know if this exists in Corvallis, have these bike lane ends sign. And this is as lazy as the Sharrow, which is someone had to decide to make that sign, to authorize that sign and install that sign. And what are you supposed to do on a bike? The sign usually exists at a place where the bike lane ends into a really, really, really hostile area. So it serves absolutely no purpose to have that sign there. It's of no help and no use and is very lazy. And if a city official wants to do something like that, then really they ought to be looking harder at how to make the connectivity improved. And other things that our communities do, again from Eugene, so I'm not picking on Corvallis here, is to have these types of meaningless speed limit signs or campaigns. Slow down, act like our children play here, right? There's nothing wrong with the signs, but they don't actually achieve any of the goals unless the street is actually designed to get to the speed that's being desired. To put a sign like this, it says, please go 20 without changing the design of the speed. It makes it clear to motorists that 20 miles an hour is the maximum comfortable speed you can go in a car. These signs don't actually result in anything. They just make people feel good. Okay, so there's a couple final things before I wrap up here. Hopefully I'm giving you enough provocative things for us to go on. I'm definitely able to say things out loud that could not be said by city staff for good reason. I am definitely able to say things that elected officials often cannot say out loud for sometimes good reason. So I hope that we can take that into the Q&A and to the conversation. But a couple final things. So the story of some of these great cycling cities of Denmark and of Netherlands actually follows a somewhat similar script to what can be happening here. There's a few differences, but there's actually a lot of similarities. And the basic narrative is that there were streets before the age of the automobile that were occupied by people doing all kinds of people things. And that as the automobile became more affordable, more accessible, more dominant, the policies and the designs of our streets and the priority of our streets got turned over to the use, the movement, and the storage of cars. And so lots of very cute European plazas that we might see in pictures, or maybe some people have been able to visit in whatever European country that you may have been to or seen and fantasized about going to, became parking lots for cars, and many still are. And it's only through deliberate policy that they have reversed, some places have reversed over the last 50 years. So the story here is similar to what's happened in the US cities, other than most of our communities, especially west of the Mississippi, grew up in the automobile age. And so we might not have had the same sort of pre-automobile use of the bike or kind of human-centered large city design that has some like sort of generational memory about. But how did things then change from streets for people to streets for cars? Well, what happened in both Denmark and the Netherlands in the early 1970s was, and throughout the 70s, is a few things that happened at the same time. There was an oil crisis. So those who were alive in the 1970s might remember the OPEC oil embargo that limited the supply of oil around the world. And so there was a shortage of oil and shortage of gasoline for cars. At the same time, there was environmental awakening, right? Beginnings of Earth Day. There was also started to become a lot of protests led by moms who were tired of their children being killed by cars on the streets. And so these three things came together to begin to slowly change street design. And over 50 years, you get to a point where half of trips can actually happen by people on bike, such as in this very normal green light starting place in the city of Utrecht in the Netherlands. Like, this is what it's like. It was not like a special festival day or a special location or anything like that. It's like this level of volume in the sort of heart of the city all the time, every day of the week. And that's what has happened over 50 years. And for us now, we have these examples to learn from. We don't have to take 50 years to actually get there, right? We can learn from places abroad, and we can learn from some of the experimentation that's happening here. We certainly have an environmental crisis, for sure. And I think what we need is some leadership and some pressure to make our leadership triggered to actually move more boldly in this direction. The last thing that I want to share is something that's called induced demand. That's sort of the wonky version of it, but the common language for it is a basic truism in transportation planning, which is build it and they will come. And it happens and it works and it applies to all transportation modes. It's just a policy choice that we make. When we build and expand roads, we get more traffic. So if anyone has lived like in LA or Houston or Portland maybe, or any other place that has had their freeways expand because of congestion, the congestion gets fixed at the beginning and then it just gets more congested. That's called induced demand. You build it and they will come. The research is equally clear that when you build high quality, protected bicycle infrastructure into networks, you also get more people biking. This is just a policy choice. Do we want to allocate our time and our effort and our money to induce more car trips or to induce more trips by people on bike? So that is my talk. I had forgotten to put any apple pie in anywhere else. So here's my token pie. And I think I will turn it back over to Steve.
All right. Thank you, Marc. For those of you who arrived late to the talk, Marc will be answering your questions. I'd like to direct your attention to the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. You can click on that and enter your questions. Many of you have already begun doing that. While you are typing your questions for Marc into the Q&A window, I'd like to introduce our moderator. She was born and raised in Corvallis. Shout out to Crescent Valley, class of 2001. She is the Sustainable Transportation Manager with OSU and a co-author of OSU's 2030 Sustainable Transportation Strategy. Please welcome Sarah Bronstein.
Thanks, Steve. And thanks, Mark, for your presentation. I know that our audience is engaged because we have a lot of questions for you. And I'm going to dive into as many as I can in the time that we have left. We're going to try and give ourselves a sharp cutoff at 8:30, so we'll see what we can address in this time. Before I get into the questions in our Q&A, I did want to start with one for myself. And that's that at the beginning of your talk, Mark, you mentioned something that I feel is true, which is that Corvallis is very special and very unique, just like everywhere else. And so I wanted to ask you to maybe expand on that idea. And I'll just start by saying that working in the transportation industry myself, I often hear from people that the things that happen in the Netherlands are not necessarily transferable to the United States because it's Europe. And the same is true when you talk about, say, a design that worked in Portland. Well, that's Portland. That can't really work here. And so I'm wondering if transportation engineering is really so context sensitive, or if we're doing ourselves a disservice by dismissing some of these ideas.
Yeah, we like to think that we're really special, and it's important to celebrate the uniqueness of all of our places that we live and the quirkiness and the pride that we have in our own communities. Of course, like none of us want to just be a cookie cutter of any other community. But in the transportation world, I think I don't think that's a very helpful way of thinking about things. I mean, we don't have different street design for car travel from one community to another. We don't think like, oh, we don't want a street like Portland has. We don't want to become Portland of Corvallis or Portland of Eugene in the way that we can move about by cars. And so that I don't think that really applies for the bicycle infrastructure either. I think that, and I'd say like one of the things that's completely the same of basically every community is how decisions get made on how street space is used. And really the norm for thinking about streets is that they're places for the movement and storage of private vehicles, and that anything other than that is generally perceived as somehow a deviation from the norm or from truth or from nature. And so maybe one way that Corvallis could be special is to say, well, wait a second, there's nothing natural about using our streets, thinking of our streets as their default position is just for the movement of cars. Maybe there's a different way we can think about how we move people through them, and we can be special in that way. I'd also say that there are some reasons why we can't draw from Copenhagen or Utrecht or Amsterdam. I mean, of course, they're older, they were created in an era of walking, some of the places, but they've also sprawled, they became very car dominant, and through advocacy and policy decisions, they've turned the tide over the last 50 years. And in Copenhagen in particular, I think has a lot for us to learn. There are many streets that you might look at them and think like, wow, those are American-sized streets. They're very rule-oriented sort of transportation system with lots of sort of traffic lights and rules that would feel quite familiar, but they've just gone a different path over the last 50 years. And I think that we can learn from that. And so, in that regard, I think there's just a lot to learn, and to dismiss sort of what these cities have been able to do, I think is really missing an opportunity. I'll give you just one quick story. In Amsterdam, Amsterdam is a very unique and special place. It has lots of canals, but as the city was moving into the car era, it became really hard to access the city center by car because there was all these damn canals all over the place, restricting access and really skinny streets. And so there became a movement to fill in the canals with roads to make car access easier. And that happened over and over and over again. And then there was this sort of one canal that basically led to the turning point of how the city switched from doing that to moving more toward thinking about biking. And it came to a vote in front of the city council to turn this one canal into a road or to keep it as a canal. And their city council in Amsterdam, imagine this, has 45 people. So imagine the politics there. Anyway, it came down to a vote, and at the end of the day, the vote was 23 to 22 to keep it a canal. That's one vote. And so you can imagine all the advocacy and the lobbying and the protests, all the normal things that we would do here to try to change policy and change direction. Same type of thing. So I think there's a lot to learn. And I think it's a little bit disingenuous to just dismiss some of the world's top cycling cities as being irrelevant and not applicable for us.
Great, thank you. I think that I'm seeing a lot of questions here related specifically to some of the comments you made early on about particular types of infrastructure. And so I want to give you an opportunity to respond. So our first question was, I think in regards to your comments on sharrows. So what additional means could be used to complement sharrows? So are sharrows always bad? Is there a case when they can work?
Sharrows are generally unnecessary, but they can be used as a second step on a street that's been otherwise slowed down through design, not slowed down with a speed limit sign change, because that doesn't actually do anything to behavior, but there's been other design interventions to the street that's maybe narrowed lanes or changed the material at an intersection that sort of communicates, hey, this is a slower area. Things like sometimes like bulb outs that sort of pinch the crosswalks with concrete that make the crossing smaller, adding street trees, adding a median with foliage. There's lots of things that add friction to a street that communicates to people in a car that you have to drive slower because it will feel uncomfortable to drive at a faster speed. Once that has been done, then you can put a sharrow down if you want. It just gives a little extra communication to everyone on that street that says like, hey, people on bike will be here. They're allowed to be here. Or if you're on a bike, like, oh, hey, there's a thing on the street that tells me that I'm a real person and I can be here. If you've done a good job with your street design that brings the speed of cars down to a way that you can mix on a bike comfortably because there's not a mismatch, then you don't need the sharrow, but it's a fine additional piece of communication to everyone, especially maybe on routes that are a little bit more popular. You can use sharrows sometimes to also sort of route people. So some sharrows have like little angles at the tip that says like, oh, hey, stay on the really popular, really nicely designed neighborhood street or something, or bike route, follow our little symbol. But they should not ever be used as just by themselves, because it gives a false sense of security. It's lazy. And I'm sorry to those of you who might be listening that are maybe slightly offended by that. Maybe that you've been responsible for putting that in. And maybe you have a great example where it has achieved a better result. I'm sure that can be possible, but in general, slapping a sharrow down onto a road without doing anything else to slow down the speed of cars isn't really a solution.
So similarly, we had a couple of people ask questions about the right turn crossing our green bike lanes, which is something that Corvallis has only recently started to do to mark those bike lanes as green in a conflict zone. So what's a good alternative to a design like that?
That's a good question. So I think maybe my critique was misunderstood because I was not very clear. So adding the green for the conflict zones, I think that's a nice thing because it does raise awareness that there's a conflict zone. The problem is that the conflict zone exists. Like there's no reason for a right-hand turning car. There's no reason that it needs to cross the bike lane to get into its own special right-hand turn lane. What ought to happen is that the bike lane stays next to the curb, goes up to the intersection, the travel lane for cars still stays on the left-hand side of the bike lane, and at the intersection is where the crossing would happen. And there's some design things that can happen at the intersection that gives priority to people on bike, like from a red light to a green light. There's a few different things that can be done to help make sure that someone on a bike is visible to a right-hand turning car. But when you create those kind of fast moving crisscross movements, they're terrible. Like anyone who's on this call who has ever been on a bike at one of those things knows what I'm talking about. It's you know, the speed differential for car travel and bike travel is usually pretty high, and that conflict zone is a real cause of stress. And it's just a design decision to prioritize right-hand turning cars in a different way. So that's the different design. The use of the green for conflict zones, I think, is completely reasonable. You know, until we have high volumes of people on bike. You know, once we have lots of people on bike all the time, we don't need these special paint or anything. But in this interim period between now and some hope for future state, those types of things, I think, you know, they do communicate that there's a possible conflict coming up. So everyone just sort of pay a little bit extra attention.
So we're getting a lot of questions in the Q&A about data. And so I'm going to try and maybe smoosh some of those together because we have so many. So people are wondering, where's the evidence that protected or buffered bike facilities actually result in increased ridership? And is it actually safer? People are wondering if you have statistics specifically on the safety of these facilities. There's some interesting questions, particularly about differentiating between safety versus comfort, because I think often when you were describing those facilities, you talked about how much more comfortable they are. Does comfort translate to safety, and is there evidence to show that that's true?
So yeah, there's evidence for all of those things. Yeah, so there's some nice papers actually titled "If You Build It, They Will Come," and some variations from them. If you want to look at some of the leading research on some of the cycle tracks, I can give you 2 names of people if you're so inclined to do internet searches, or I can, you know, share articles later on. But Jennifer Dill, who's a professor up at Portland State University, does a lot of this work and measurement, and also a guy by the name of Ralph Buehler, who's at Virginia Tech, is also a leading scholar who does a lot of data side of that, both in the US and also comparisons with different European cities as well. So a really nice set of work. So yes, there's absolutely evidence. And there's also evidence that's come out recently during COVID that the use of pop-up protected bike lanes has also led to more people biking compared to cities that didn't include those same things. So studies that are trying to, you know, tease out all the variables to isolate the bicycle infrastructure. So yes, the evidence is very clear that creating protected bikeways leads to more people biking. And the reason is because it makes it more comfortable and safer for people on bikes. Like the most dangerous thing for something for someone on bike is the collision with a car. And so when you physically separate where you are on a bike and where cars are, it is more comfortable because your stress is down, and it's safer because your opportunities for conflict are significantly reduced. The more difficult part of building out a protected infrastructure actually happens at the intersections. So building along blocks is actually relatively straightforward, but the intersections, that's where conflicts can happen a little bit more commonly because there's sort of all kinds of variation of movements. But yeah, so and I am equating comfort and safety, and the protected bike lane meets both. I mean, it's hard. So if anyone here has been on a bike in a city like Copenhagen or a city like Utrecht, you'll know what I'm saying here, which is it's an otherworldly experience to feel 100% safe, comfortable, and without risk navigating on any street in the city on a bike. Not feeling like you're in the way of a car, that you have to move over because a car is coming, that someone's going to yell at you for being on a bike or any of that. And it's really hard to sort of get that. But it's amazing. And so when you build those infrastructure and you get more people out on bike, which is what you need that infrastructure for, actually safety comes when you get more people on bike. That's the other thing. So the more people that bike, the safer it is for everyone on a bike, which is a little bit sometimes counterintuitive. Some people think of that as, the more people you might have out on a bike increases the exposure of people on bike to cars, so it might be more dangerous, but the inverse is actually true, that the more people you have on bike, the safer it is for everyone because you're more visible, you're in a clump, people in cars are seeing people on bike more regularly, know to look out when they're turning right, et cetera, things like that.
So this bicycle utopia is sounding pretty good. We had a couple of questions that I think relate to that, and that's, I'll put them together. The first is, do you have any statistics on, like in a general population, how many people are physically able to ride? Like, are there people who will not, going back to your cyclist typology, who would not benefit from this system of safer, more comfortable bikeways? And also, let's say that you are one of those people who's not physically able to ride a bike. Why would a person like that want to support a bicycle-centered city? Maybe, the title of your talk suggests that there's many benefits that redound to the general population. Maybe you can describe a little bit about that. Where's the pie? I'm ready for the pie.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different ways I think, we can think about that. So there's like 35% of the population are that no way, no how. So, so biking's not for them for whatever reason, whether it's they're just sort of opposed to it or can't do it. But interestingly, then on the flip side, actually, when you can create a good infrastructure, like I've been showing here, it's not only good for people on bike, it's actually good for people in wheelchairs as well. And so it actually addresses some infrastructure needs in that regard. Even in a place like, you see in Amsterdam, it might happen in other cities as well. There's also like these little tiny electric cars, like little tiny things that are for people with disabilities that they get with a special permit, and they're actually allowed to use them in the bike lanes as a way to allow people to access parts of the city. So there are some benefits. There's a variety of types of actually adapted bikes. So there's actually a whole wide range of bike types that meet different levels of ability. Of course, the rise of e-bikes right now as a more ubiquitous, increasingly accessible, financially accessible mode of getting around increases the number of people that could ride a bike for different distances because it takes some of the physical ability out of it. So there's sort of all those different things. Ironically, or maybe not ironically, in cities that I've shared, like the Copenhagen's and Utrecht, because so many trips are taken by people on bike, because it's so much more convenient to do it that way, it actually becomes fairly easy to drive. So ironically, making a better biking city makes it easier for people who do need to use a car for whatever reason, whether it's personal or job, to do so. So that's pretty interesting. So why, if you're not ever going to be on a bike, should you support something? I mean, that's like the same argument if you don't have kids, why should you pay for the schools? So if you care about the climate, if you care about social equity, if you care about affordability generally, if you care about the wise use of taxpayer resources, that there's never enough taxpayer dollars to maintain the existing roads that we have. So we ought to do something that has less wear and tear. If you care about your taxpayer resources that are being used, if you care about disproportionate police stops to in cars, the people of color, well, we want to have a system that's not happening anymore. If we care about public health, if you care about like the social trust that can develop when you have to navigate ambiguous shared space that you do on a bike or when you're walking or in transit, this matters, right? When we're only driving around in our cars, the number of times that we occupy similar spaces in our communities with people that are different than us is really quite rare. And so redesigning our cities to have those types of public spaces, not just on bike, I mean, plazas or campuses are really wonderful places like that. So there's all these other sort of social benefits. I don't know if there's ever like free apple pie along the way, but those would be some of the sort of the general arguments I would have.
Oh, I feel so disappointed about the apple pie.
I mean, it'd be fun. I know sometimes in Eugene during bike month, and maybe Corvallis does this too, there's like the incentives to get people out on bike to try it out. They have bagels on the bridges. So if you cross one of the bridges on bike, they'll for a free bagel. I think this has probably not happened this month during COVID, but pre-COVID and post-COVID, coffee and bagel on the bridge. So it's, we could push for apple pie one year.
There's some really great questions in the Q&A about policy. So I'm hoping to go that direction with you. We've been talking a lot about infrastructure design. Here's a two-part question, and I'll just read it to you. You mentioned deliberate policy work as the underpinning of the changes to development of dedicated cycling infrastructure abroad. At what level should that policy work be pursued here? I'm assuming there's, state level policies, local policies. And then the second part of this question is at the Oregon state level, the expansion of the bike bill, which you mentioned in regards to our bike lane infrastructure, just died in committee. And so are there particular lessons we should take from that to drive advocacy efforts here?
Yeah, good questions. Ultimately, the local bicycle infrastructure is governed by local policy and local code. So some caveats, some streets are owned by the city, some are owned by the county, some are owned by the state, and whoever owns them generally has domain over how they're designed. But generally speaking, street design is a local decision. So it's totally within your power to have different default design standards. So I don't know what the default design standard for an arterial or collector street in Corvallis is, but certainly a local policy could be that the default design bicycle standard for a collector or arterial street is a protected bikeway. That is a policy that could be done. Another policy could eliminate minimum parking standards completely from the city to free and liberate some space. That's slightly tangential that we can go into if we want. That generally, I don't know what Corvallis's approach to that is, but some cities are going in that direction. So that's just sort of at the local level. The state level, ODOT is, sorry, they're generally not a friend for this type of thing. And it's not ODOT specifically, and departments of transportation across the country are really state departments of highways. They're predominantly about building roads, expanding roads, engineering car-based transportation. Oregon is more progressive than most, both by statute, because of 1% of our gas tax money has to go to bike infrastructure. And there are some few good, but few staff at ODOT that actually do understand about that local transportation movement is different than city to city street design or highway design. But in general, the departments of transportation are actually really big barriers for local communities for doing more for two reasons. One, they're almost always hesitant to redesign the streets that they own in any reasonable way that works for local transport. And two, a lot of the money that goes for transportation passes through the State Department of Transportation. And the entire sort of reinforcing culture of the departments of highways, departments of transportation, is to view streets, all streets basically, as highways, and the purpose of highways are to move vehicles unimpeded. So anything that gets in the way of that is generally not understood and not valued. So what to do about it? I think that maybe the reference was that there was a push to increase the share of funding at the state level from 1% of the gas tax money in Oregon to 5% to go into bike infrastructure, which would be great. I guess keep trying. I mean, the state recently passed a bill to allow stop signs to be treated as yield signs for people on bike. And that took many years of trying and trying and trying. And there's always this pushback, and then it passed. And I was like, oh, okay, no big deal. And so maybe this is just the same thing. The era that we're in now, I think, is very ripe. I mean, it's a bummer that it died, because I think that this is actually the moment where it should have passed, and maybe we'll still be in this moment 2 years from now. I mean, the urgent challenges of climate change, of structural inequity, combined with the huge amount of investment dollars in transportation and infrastructure that are about to flow from the federal government down to states and localities is a once in a generation opportunity to actually build sort of bike infrastructure 2.0. Do it in a new way. So it is a real missed opportunity at the state level.
I want to follow up on that, because there's several people who asked in particular about what citizens should be doing. What's the most effective type of advocacy that you've seen in other communities in terms of speaking up about your desires to your community and pushing for the political will to make this type of investment choices that you're describing?
It's a good question. I think there's lots of different paths for advocacy. If we had the magic wand version, we would do it. I think that, it's important to show up, right? So if you think about this stuff, most people don't think about this stuff. And the hard part is that most people in most communities, their entire lived reality is getting around by car. And so it's really hard to imagine anything different. And that's a real barrier to making change happen. And so given that, most people, including usually most of our elected officials, just given where you have to be in your life to be basically a volunteer elected official for smaller communities, they don't know this stuff either. And so one, you just have to make your voice known. But I think it's helpful to share what it is that you want, and maybe personalize it a little bit, and maybe personalize it for those of you with kids that way. So the way that I talk about it in Eugene, for example, and it's not that I'm really successful in Eugene. I mean, Eugene frustrates me to no end. But the way that I talk about it is I have 3 kids, they're big now, but there's the city of Eugene has one library. It's downtown. I live in the most walkable part of the city of Eugene. I live on the most popular bicycle corridor in the community. And there is no way for my children to bike to the one amazing library that we have in town. So here's the city put in this great investment. It's a fantastic library. And it's, I don't know, 1.5 miles from my house. There is zero way for a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, or anyone who's that interested but concerned person to get to the library by bike. So I think telling stories of what is it that you want in that way makes a lot of sense. Building on the investments that the community has already made, right? So in this case, well, we built this amazing library. Don't we want our children to be able to get there and be American and be free and independent? And wow, it's great as parents to not have to schlep them everywhere. My kid wants to go to the library, sweet, go. And so I think that's one way to frame it, but you have to show up. You have to, I think the other way is to challenge the traffic engineer. So I don't know the traffic engineer in the city of Corvallis. And so I won't say anything good or bad because I just don't know that person. So generically, traffic engineer in most cities hold a disproportionate power about what the street looks like. And they hold that power because they have to sign documents that hold them liable if things go wrong. And so traffic engineers, they get trained on what the role of the street is and how to design a street. And the entirety of that training, including the testing that engineers do to be professionally certified, is exclusively and wholly about car transportation. There's not anything about people on bikes. And so when that gets moved into the professional world, it gets reinforces, and it reinforces the lived experience by many of us as well, which is getting around by cars and thinking like, yeah, like why would I want any of the space on my street to be used for anything else? Because I'm getting around by car. And so the power disproportionately gets held by the traffic engineer, which is one of the reasons why I actually made these books. These books are 100% intended to counter that disproportionate power, to actually give power and evidence and language to everyone else to be able to show up at city meetings, be on city committees, participate in public forums, wherever the avenues are to have your voice heard, to give regular people or people in other professions the language and the examples to use to lower the risk aversion that is sort of typical, in addition to the sort of lack of training from that profession that holds that disproportionate power at the local level, and is the reason why state departments of transportation are disproportionately also focused on the movement of cars.
I'm glad you brought up city staff, because we just gave advocates kind of a playbook for how to proceed, but I did also see that we have a couple city staffers in our participant list, and so I want to give you an opportunity to address what our city staff and also elected officials should be doing if they are interested in moving the needle on pursuing projects like this. And I'll add to that by saying, Corvallis, you had mentioned that you weren't sure about what our design standards are like in the city of Corvallis. So we recently adopted a transportation system plan in 2018 that changed the design standard for the cross section of a busier street, our arterials and collectors, to include buffered bike lanes. And as a result, we've started to see some interesting projects happen where sometimes when a street is being repaved or restriped, those buffers are being added as a retrofit. And we also have a planned network of bicycle boulevards, or here we call them neighborhood bikeways, in that plan. And so what should our city staff be doing to most effectively implement those great ideas that we have enshrined in a plan now as a starting point?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first off, I love it that staff is here, and I will assume that the staff that are on the call are amazing people working extremely hard, trying to make Corvallis a fantastic city. So I will say that the staff that I work with in the city of Eugene, especially around biking, are very smart, very knowledgeable about this topic, and yet they are a little bit limited because they don't always receive the support from their higher ups, including people at the city manager level and their elected officials. And if you're anyone that works for the city trying to do new things in the community, particularly with thinking about repurposing or reallocating space on a street, it's something that the public has a lot of opinions about. And in general, there are a lot of negative opinions about parking removal, travel lane removal, or repurposing them. And so as staff, it can become really hard to get yelled at a lot for things. And if you're not backed up by your higher ups, including your elected officials, it becomes really hard to continue to be bold and do that work. And so I think it's important to remind the higher ups, especially when you have a climate action plan, a new transportation system plan that calls for these new things to be done. It's important to go to the higher ups and say, hey, you passed these policies or you adopted these plans, were you serious or not? Because you are not backing up your vote with the design ideas that staff are putting forward that could then get sort of yelled at by the public. So that's another place of sort of advocacy. It's a little non-traditional advocacy, but it's kind of to go up maybe the middle rung. So sometimes it's important to go to elected officials. Sometimes it's important to go directly to the staff or the project managers. And sometimes it's important to go to the bosses of the staff who don't always have the back of the staff who are really good. But I would say, I think one thing that we've really learned during the COVID era by looking internationally, actually, it's really reinforced the value of pilot projects. One of the things that's happened during the COVID era is that many cities around the world were able to redesign streets basically overnight to address our emergency, right? We needed space on our streets to have public open space in front of our housing, so we could play, we can socialize in a distance way, so we can walk down the middle of the street, so we could travel if we weren't using buses or Ubers or Lyft or those other things. And what a lot of cities realized is actually the time that they need to change the street could be done really quickly and with very limited public engagement. And so one of the problems we have here in Oregon is that we do too much public engagement, as though engaging a public that does not have an experience, a lived, real experience about what it's like to be in a system that works really well for a 10-year-old to get around by bike. It's really hard to have a lot of a public engagement to convince people. And so the use of pilot interventions, low cost, cheap stuff, bollards, cones, paints over a limited period of time to give people experience of what it's like to be on a different type of separated infrastructure or a quieter residential street, I think is a really great way to do things quickly and to give more of the public kind of a lived experience, so that when the conversations are of doing something more permanent, there'll be people who be like, oh yeah, I really like that when we had the bollards or the hay bales sort of separating, the bikeway and the moving cars. That was really cool. Yeah, if we did that permanently, oh yeah, I love that. It was so great. I was able to bike next to my kid, to go grab an ice cream. I really loved it. So the use of pilot programs, that's sort of temporary things that can be removed, I think we're in a good era to do a lot of that type of experimentation right now.
Awesome. I like the idea of some low-cost actions that both city officials and citizens can take right now. And I think that we're getting close to time. Or in fact, it looks like we're right at 8:30. And so I know Steve is probably going to want to take over and have some closing remarks. Thanks, folks, for hanging on throughout the Q&A. You guys are all troopers. And I'll pass it off to Steve.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Marc, for that great talk. And Marc and Sarah, that was a fabulous conversation. I don't want it to end. Thank you to the audience for all those great questions. Just a bracing discussion. I'm afraid we're out of time. I don't want this to end, but we've got to end. And with the remaining time, I'd like to thank the City of Corvallis and its Empowerment Grant Program and the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition for helping make this event possible. If you'd like more information about some of these things we're talking about, check out these links here. There's the link to Marc's Rethinking Streets books. They're fantastic books, so much information and very thought-provoking. And you can download OSU's Sustainable Transportation Strategy at the link here. And it has many of the same designs that you see in Rethinking Streets. And if you'd like to get involved with the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition, the Transportation Action Team, or another coalition action team, please visit the Sustainability Coalition website, which you see here. So thanks again to Marc and Sarah, the City of Corvallis, and a very special thanks to all of you for attending. Take care and good night.
Thank you very much, everyone.